And welcome to another edition of the Nerdy Agent Podcast. I'm your host, Luke Pettersen, with my brothers and fellow nerds, Josh and AJ. Today, we are.
Has anything happened in the last week?
No, nothing important has happened. So we're going to talk about the NAR settlement. Essentially, you've probably heard about this, unless you've been living under a rock. Essentially, NAR has settled the commission lawsuit case, and there's a lot of pending approval.
What would it be like to live under a rock?
It would hurt. You should ask Patrick. No, of course you dig a little hole underneath.
But like,
the rock,
could you get?
You're
You could probably get
smashed against the rock.
How do you get out?
Is your address
the rock like Patrick?
If I sold the rock, would I have to pay a buyer's agent commission?
It's a great question. No,
right now you probably you don't need to. It'd be negotiated. Depending on what you wanted to do. But NAR settled the case. We're gonna run through the bullet points of it. And then essentially just give some opinions. AJ and Josh were already giving their opinions before we rolled, and I thought, let's just roll, and then we can talk about it. So just to start, essentially what happened, they settled the lawsuit for $418 million, and some practice changes. The most notable changes that are going to go into effect, which I think the timer on them going into effect started when the settlement was filed. So not when the judge approves, but when the settlement was filed, the days started. Is that correct?
I don't know.
You don't know that.
It was
I'm pretty sure I read that
5 years from that date. Maybe is what it was.
Well, no. The into when these had to go into effect, the practice changes, not the end of the suit.
Right. So I'm saying like mid-July, and it was mid-July 2019 when the suit started. Is what you're saying? 5 years from that date. I saw something about 5 years.
Oh, maybe it was the 5 years from the date. I thought it was 90 days from the filing of this settlement.
Of the agreement.
It was somewhere around there.
Yeah.
Either way. Which ends up being mid-July. The first one and maybe most notable, depending on if you work with Zillow or not, is that you cannot have buyer broker compensation offers on the MLS. So they're going to completely remove that section that states what the broker compensation for bringing a buyer on that listing is. Notably important to note is that doesn't mean sellers can't offer buyer compensation. It means it can't be listed. From what we understand from reading the document, it also means that other websites that the MLS syndicates to, so sends listings to, whether it's Zillow, Realtor.com, all those sites, they also can't list it.
So this is compensation. I have a couple of analogies here. Do you remember when you did an island in your house like 2 years ago, and the electrical code was such that you were required to have an outlet on both sides of the island, right? And then I think a kid touched a crock pot somewhere in the United States and got hurt. And now you cannot have an outlet on your island at all. So this is kind of similar to what we're experiencing now. The same entity that said you have to pay something if you're a part of our association is now agreeing that you can't offer anything on our website.
On our platform.
Can't list it, but it can be offered. It just can't be listed.
Correct. Cannot be on the MLS.
Here's the question. What if you called... So like when people are going through this, they're going to call the listing agent and ask that question, say, is there any buyer broker comp? Correct. And they'll have to tell them then off the settlement. It's just it added such a step that's so
I think they're going to have
surprising.
they're going to have to email a document signed by the listing agent and the sellers that has the actual buyer rep signed, so that they would know for sure. Otherwise, it's just wild, wild west. You'd be like, yeah, I'm offering 8%, and then they come in, and you're like, sorry, we're not offering anything.
You know what the interesting thing about that is? There's a function on the MLS, if you didn't know, listing agents, that when someone schedules a showing, you can auto send them supplements from the listing.
Yep.
Would that be allowed to have that document in it, or is that going to be considered a part of the MLS?
That is unclear at this time.
Very unclear. But that makes sense. That's kind of what I was thinking.
The other question is like notes, right? Can I put in there?
You cannot put it in the notes.
Can't be listed.
You can list seller agrees to up to 2.7% in concessions.
However, the document said that the concessions cannot have anything to do with paying a buyer's agent.
No. Not that they can't have anything to do with it. They can't be tied to it. So they could say 2.7% concession to the buyer and be saying code, essentially, if you will, that they are paying a commission, right?
Yep.
That's possible. I don't know the legality of that, obviously. But it cannot be we are only paying it to a buyer's agent. It has to be offered to the buyer to compensate their own agent. So like if they said, thanks for the 2.7, I'll pay my buyer 2, and I want this 0.7, they can do that. That's what it's encouraging.
Yes.
The second most notable, the second big piece on there is the fact that in order to show a house to a buyer client, you need to have a written agreement with them, and that written agreement has to state what the buyer's broker is going to get paid upon them buying a house, even if the seller is going to end up paying the buyer's broker. However, whatever is listed in that buyer contract, the buyer's broker cannot get paid more than that percentage. So if the contract states 2.5% to be paid or 2.7% to be paid to the buyer's broker, if the seller is willing to pay 3%,
it goes to the buyer.
I don't know who it goes to.
I mean, it gets.
I know the
gets
buyer's broker
baked into
can't
the deal.
get it,
and
but I don't know.
The buyer would get it.
I don't think
my
it
one
didn't explicitly state.
My
the
one
buyer
question
would get
on that though, guys, would be: what if it is higher? Couldn't you just go back to your buyer and say this seller is actually offering higher?
it. You could amend the contract.
I'd love to split the difference with you, and we can get some closing costs covered.
Whoa. Hold on. The seller is still paying concessions. It's no different than if you get a sewer line and they pay concessions, right? That's how this is all getting lumped together. It's not a separate concession.
No, the seller can still pay a buyer's agent commission outside of seller concessions.
The confusing part, Josh, is what we were going back and forth on the text thread was.
As you can tell, we're even confused about this.
They could either pay a closing cost to the buyer to pay their own agent.
Yes.
Or they could just pay the agent directly. It says this doesn't explicitly stop sellers from paying their agent. Now, I think, again, this is a preliminary agreement, and I've read briefs from the Department of Justice that might not like that part. They want buyers to pay their agents directly.
Seems like it's going to land on sellers can pay the buyer however much they want to up until a point where the buyer can no longer get concessions from a lending standpoint. And then the buyer's settlement is still going to always have the buyer's agent on that side of the settlement statement. So, like, if I negotiate 2.7 with my buyer, but the seller's agent the seller wants to pay 3%, the buyer would still get 3%, but I would only get 2.7 of that.
Currently, though, if the seller is offering 3% buyer's agent commission and it's not listed on the MLS, it wouldn't be considered a concession. And they could give you 3% closing costs towards your closing costs, and they could pay the buyer's agent. Currently,
yes.
They can do that.
Because what it would look like is the settlement statement would just be different in those two scenarios. So in one scenario, the buyer's commission would be on the buyer's side, and the seller paid closing costs would come from the seller to cover that, essentially. Mm-hmm. On the other side, the seller could pay those closing costs that would just go directly to the cash to close, and then the seller side would list that they're paying the buyer's agent.
It just seems like what the DOJ wants is the first scenario where if the buyer is getting compensation, it's coming from the seller, and they're using that compensation to pay for their own agent.
That's what they've been saying in some of their briefs, is that kind of situation. And I know too that I guarantee you that lenders are all on the horn this entire week, and within 2-3 weeks they'll have a solution where you can finance those commissions as well.
Mm-hmm.
That would make the most sense.
I think one option we could consider as a team of our size is, what if we did a buy now, pay later type situation for the commissions, where some of it gets paid at the closing and then it gets paid over a 2-year period of time. Truthfully, if you could legally set that up, you could charge an interest rate that's slightly less than the going interest rate on the market right now, and you would do pretty well and encourage buyers to work with you because you have flexible commission terms.
Smart idea.
That being said, there is a lot of question marks there, because one could also argue that, and I don't know how much factor the Federal Housing Administration has in communication with the DOJ, but if lenders aren't willing to allow buyers to finance these buyer's agent commissions, or they're concerned because what happens on the appraisal then if they're financing 2% extra on a $400,000 house, does it have to appraise at 408 or does it have to appraise at 400, right? The government has always been, the Federal Housing Administration has been hyper-focused on affordability in housing. And so if they have concern over first-time home buyers or VA buyers or FHA buyers being able to pay the buyer's agent commission, the DOJ might be hearing from them on that, and that could very well not happen.
Well, and back up there a second, the VA buyer, even if they can afford to pay the agent, isn't allowed to by law right now. So that's and
I'm sure the VA is in the DOJ's ear then, right?
Well, yeah,
to an extent.
If I was going to get my soapbox for anything, my only frustration from an agent standpoint, I'm like, we have to prove our worth, right? I posted about this yesterday. My belief is if agents can't prove that they're worth this commission rate, then this is a valid thing that needs to go into place to prove that we actually are worth what we're being paid, right? If we were only making what we were making because the sellers were paying it and it was like a hidden fee, then we weren't worth it in the first place. So we have to work harder to prove our worth. I'm fine with that. My biggest complaint actually about the whole thing is that the impact is to first-time home buyers. They're already going through a reality of like record high housing prices, terrible inventory, having to waive all sorts of stuff,
high interest rates,
crazy high interest rates. And like you think about no offense, like if boomers are watching this, but I'm like, those guys bought houses for $50,000. They have interest rates now of 3%. They have or houses paid off, and now they don't have to pay commissions on them to buyers agents. And you're going to ask a 20-year-old
necessarily,
and you're going to ask a 22-year-old kid who's trying to buy their first house, or 25, or now it's probably 28, that's been trying to save money in a high inflationary environment and paying a 7% interest rate. It just feels like it's a really self-serving reality that we're asking first-time homebuyers to basically take on the chin here.
Well, and think about this scenario. I mean, I was just talking about this with a couple of my buddies this morning on calls. You're a first-time homebuyer, and you come to me, and I say, in my agreement, well, sorry, you can't see a house. It's government mandated that you sign this agreement with me.
Yep.
Government mandated. It's not. I'm not doing this to be salesy. I am legally required to do this, or I'm going to get in big trouble. Right. So you have that. That's a barrier for everybody. And then you say my rate that I charge to represent buyers is 2.7%. Sometimes the seller pays that. Sometimes they don't. Now, what happens when they can't afford the 2.7%?
Yep.
I have to put it in the contract anyways, according to how this works. And now we get to a situation where there's a house that says I'm not paying anything. And now my two options as their representative
pro
are
bono.
You can work for free, which nobody's going to really decide to do, or you can send them to the listing agent, or they can't see the house. Those are really your three options legally? I mean, that's what you can do.
Right. Currently, the hope would be that there's a fourth option where you lump it into the mortgage.
Yeah, and to that point,
sure.
To that point, though, the frustration, the second frustration lies in the problem with what NAR did initially with forcing people to offer compensation. This is what I said previously when we talked about this, is like you're forcing a behavior, you're trying to control a process, and that creates people that are pissed off, right? And I think it's justified that people are pissed off by that because it's a stupid thing that they should never have even considered forcing. But now, on the flip side, we're basically forcing the opposite.
Yep.
Why would we not give sellers the opportunity to do what they want to do through the process? If they want to offer 0, and be public with it. If they want to offer 2 and be public with it. But like forcing them to not be able to post what they want to do seems really backwards to me.
Not to mention that one of the unique takes on this was that they argued that a listing that listed, let's say, 1.5 or 2% compensation was less likely or more likely to be not pushed to their clients, right? So like I see it and it's 1.5 and I say, I'm just not going to send it to my client. Or if my client sends it to me, I'm going to tell them it's not a good fit for them. The agent that was doing that is still going to just reach out to the listing agent, ask what it is, find out what it is. And if it's not high enough, they're going to try and do that anyways. And because they're snaky. Like,
but because of
unethical people.
The buyer rep contract, it doesn't matter now though. Because the buyer rep contract says what you're getting paid anyways. So you wouldn't have any benefit to take less anyway. Like
unless you knew your client couldn't do it.
Sure, but like it's true. More so right. Now having the flexibility to know as a buyer, like, oh, this one's only paying 2, so I got to pay an extra 0.7 if I want to buy this house.
Yeah.
Now as a buyer, I'm making my own decisions with full information versus I don't know what it's going to be, and I may have to pay $10,000, and I may not have to pay $10,000.
Theoretically, you're going to know before you see the house because you'll just ask.
But
then you have to ask every single house you see, what is the commission rate?
That's the part that I think.
Why would they not just post it?
That should just get thrown out. It doesn't make any sense. And again, I've said this before. I'd say 80 to 90% of agents aren't worth what they're getting paid.
100%.
It's not a bold statement to say that. It's just to make this sweeping change it's impacting a system that's existed for a very long time. So it's going to be really interesting to see how the consumer changes their behavior and whether sellers in Minnesota decide that they don't want to pay a buyer's agent, because truthfully, a lot of what we're seeing here is because of other states having overlay rules or systems that were very non-transparent. There's still states right now that have no buyer rep agreements. Okay. You get paid and you don't have to have an agreement. There's 33 of those.
That's wild.
That's crazy.
We're one of 17 states that has buyer rep agreements. 33 of them do not. You don't have to have one. There's also a lot of states, including those same ones, where the listing agent brokerage collects all of the commissions and then pays the buyer's brokerage. So the seller doesn't even doesn't even get to know how much of the commission they paid.
The
that
settlement
goes to the
statement states that it's going to the listing brokerage.
Exactly. And so there's no transparency in that. Whereas in Minnesota, I think the consumer's already understanding, because our contract says total commission and buyer's agent payout.
And our net sheet shows it too.
Exactly. We have compensation disclosures that the buyer sign before they even make an offer on a property of how much money you're going to get paid. So our state was already pretty transparent. So,
well, our listing documents stay 6% total with 2.7 or whatever going to buyers.
5.5 and 2.5, 7 and 3.5.
Says like on the document.
It's right there. And yeah, the frustration is, I think, that the lack of quality across the industry is what ultimately is causing this to happen.
And the efforts by NAR to control how the bottom performers are getting paid and ensure they are getting paid.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's going to be interesting. The one big topic that you haven't written on here that I think is going to be fascinating, and I just talked about this with Steve Gurton, who said he's going to chime in, so I'll give him a shout out. Why, like open houses?
What happens?
We talked about that.
What happens at open houses? Because is that considered a tour, or is that considered an open house?
Was it Kendall on the Fast Forward movement yesterday that said in Ontario? Don't quote me on either of those. That at open houses they legally have to have a document at the front door that states agency agreements and states what agency is and explains what that is.
Like
so we're going to put a 2-page document on the front door and nobody's going to read it.
No, of course.
It's just like, what are they? It's just people sitting at a desk trying to figure out.
The open house is a huge question because if
that's not a tour, then
what is?
We're holding 24/7 open houses on every single listing of ours.
But yeah, I mean that's what you would do.
Why
right?
Why wouldn't you?
Call it a brokerage, but could you call it on your listings, right? Let's say you have a listing, you put a sign on there that says open houses available 24/7 and call this number, and then they call that number and then you set up an open house just for that one showing.
Schedule open house through showing time.
And that's where I think I want to talk to attorneys about what that actually means. The other thing you could do hypothetically is if a seller agrees to it, what's stopping us from letting buyers tour our listings without someone present?
Yeah.
But you'd have to have them tour without someone present unless they had a buyer representation contract.
The buyer rep contract
is what's stopping that from happening, right? And then now all the listing companies are become huge lead generators on their own listings.
Mm-hmm. The buyer rep contract becomes an interesting piece here. I will say, and I don't love all the agents coming out and saying this is great and this is so exciting and change is whatever. I don't hate the idea that I have to get a buyer rep contract that states what I'm going to get paid.
Oh, I don't either.
Because I feel like I should get those. And I'm kind of a lot of the time when you're showing houses with buyers, you're just like showing houses until they offer and they could just choose to do something at any time. Whereas I feel like if I sit down for an hour meeting with somebody and I run them through everything and then I just run them through the buyer rep contract and explain the situation and I get a buyer rep, it's going to be a lot more seamless for the back end processes for myself personally.
In a weird way, if in theory this limits the buyer pool a little bit, and then only agents that can show their value are able to get buyer clients, and the buyer clients will sign up with them on the front end, the market might get a little bit less competitive.
Theoretically, it should.
And the buyers who are out there will be only serious buyers, and you'll know you're getting paid by every one of them from the start. So it's like it might be a little less chaotic. But I don't know.
That's from an agent perspective. I understand the thought, and that's what I thought as well. From a consumer perspective,
it's worse for them.
They are going to hate that.
Oh, it's for sure worse. It's for sure worse for them. That's
the only thing as agents. To me, the worst part is the buyer's going to ask you, how much do I have to pay you for this house? How much do I have to pay you for this house? Yeah. How much do I have to pay you for this house?
I don't like comparing us to used car salesmen, but I think too many people compare us to doctors, anyways. You imagine if you imagine
lawyers, Luke.
You imagine if you had
to 90 hours.
You imagine if you went to Luther Hopkins Honda and before you walked in the door you had to sign an agreement that you were going to work with them and they were going to get paid on you purchasing a car. You'd be like,
it's crazy.
I'd like to not do that.
I'm just looking.
Like I'm not ready to agree to something like
that. But
I
own the cars.
And this car is going to be sold tomorrow, but I haven't even talked to a lender. I haven't interviewed any other agents. Like I have no idea what I'm doing right now. And you're telling me I have to agree to this. And there's going to be agents that put 12, 18, 24-month contracts on these. And they state that the buyer's broker has to sign off on the cancellation, and they're not going to give it to him.
No, they won't. It's very true. And they're going to put, and there's going to be agents out there that put 4% and 5% and they 6%.
Exactly. Because there's going to be consumers. There always are consumers.
So you're saying we're going to have another
know.
lawsuit in the future about how buyer brokers overcharged for buyer services during this world?
If we want to go into the history.
Or they're going to sue NAR because they made it harder for them to get representation.
If we want to go into the history of real estate commissions, you could look at the fact that the uncoupling and creating the buyer's agent commission and why we have buyer's agent commissions paid by sellers is because the DOJ wanted that to happen.
1996, I think.
That's why the system is currently how it is. So yeah, there's a very real chance that in 30 years, the system that they just decided now creates things that they don't like that ends up in another lawsuit.
Or people say this, like, is it going to be illegal still to be, like, some states I think still have this as illegal to be a sub agent of the seller because that's what it used to be,
right?
And
but you weren't actually helping the buyer; you were helping the seller.
There was no buyer representation.
Yeah, exactly, and that was a problem.
I say it. I literally and I told you this at the draft on Sunday, the big draft we had, in which case the mergers and acquisitions fantasy baseball team are going to win the whole thing this year in the 2024 fantasy league. Yes. But I had a buyer who went to an open house this last weekend because their last agent maybe sent them through a lot of open houses and they liked it. And I was like, I'd like to go back and see that open house. And they're like, we probably want to offer on this house. And I looked at the sales in the neighborhood and I walked in and said, this house is $50,000 overpriced.
Yep.
Like, we can't buy this house. Like, I won't let you pay that price. And that they were at the open house and the listing agent looked at them and said, hey, we decided to price like aggressively because we didn't want to get in a bidding war. And we felt like the seller just wants this. So if you just give them that, you're good. And that if they didn't have representation, they would overpay by $50,000.
That's what I would do if I was trying to get my seller the most money.
100% you would.
That's your job.
You're not representing the buyer. They'll get fleeced.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. If you're a good agent, if you're a bad agent, you might just be like, yeah, let's buy this house. Right? Like, that's the problem.
And it still can happen.
But in theory, it's like we have to, and that's what I wrote yesterday, is like we have to figure out a way, on the front end, to make sure this works for the people that are going to be able to do it. But the people who are going to be buyer's agents going forward have to figure out a way to prove their value. Right? So you have to be as good as Luke was there and say, like, you can't buy this house. You're overpaying by $50,000. And then they'll go, oh, well, maybe I should pay Luke $10,000 to tell me that I shouldn't be overpaying by $50,000 in these scenarios, right? But every agent that can't do that right now, or that's just trying to move units or whatever, you're not going to survive in the future if that's all you're going to try to do. You're going to have to add value to the transaction, or else you're not going to make it.
100%. Mm-hmm. I was listening to. Do you follow BAM Media, Broke Agent Media? They're really good with this stuff. They're very knowledgeable. They call themselves the knowledge brokers. And I thought that was a really good term to start thinking about yourself as a buyer's agent. You have to be a knowledge broker. At this point, if you don't know the contracts, there are a lot of agents that haven't read them. You need to read the contracts and you need to understand this stuff, because my thought is I could just go line by line through a buyer rep contract, spend 30 minutes on top of my buyer presentation explaining all this stuff. And when you get to the end, there won't really be any questions. They'll understand. And if they understand and you create the transparency, you'll be able to get the contract and there won't be any issues in that scenario. You should also probably read the lawsuit documents in the settlement case so you understand what's in there. And when someone asks you a question, you should say, hey, I read these documents and this is what I read. I listened and I read these articles and I listened to these podcasts and this is what people are saying about them as well, versus just listening to what people are saying, because you don't know if the person you're listening to, we read them, but you don't know if we're saying what's actually in the documents.
Right.
Unless you read the documents.
Right.
Yep.
That's all we have.
Is that it?
What do you? I mean, get on your soapbox, Age. What's one more thing you want to leave people with today?
I don't know. I mean, it's going to be a really crazy shakeup. I think the innovation that's going to come from it will probably be very, very fun to watch. Whether that's like buy now, pay later. Like that's an innovative idea that you could get people on board with, and it would maybe save them money even if they were going to finance. The other thing that I think you'll see is more a la carte type service options. Yep. So whether that's, because with online leads, like we do a lot of that, the question will be like, well, how do you get a representation agreement signed before that first showing? And it's like, well, that service offering is probably going to have to be different on that first showing than potentially if you were to enter in a full-blown contract. So there'll be differing layers of contracts that are out there, and there'll be property-specific agreements. There'll be full-on agreements. There'll be partial agreements, non-exclusive agreements. There might be more of that kind of stuff coming out, I think. But just dealing with a couple of these initial headaches is going to be interesting.
You also wonder if they are, if they're looking at or if they've thought about the repercussions on any of these companies that do referral-based businesses. So not necessarily even agent to agent. So like if AJ refers me a client, let's say in Iowa, I typically would give him some sort of a referral fee, whether it's 20%, 25, 30%. The unique thing on that is that would still work because it would just be whatever the commission ends up being. But I was reading an article this morning that said some of these places, I think Homes for Heroes, maybe, don't quote me, it wasn't just them, say, we'll give you 1% of the purchase price in closing costs concessions, or 1.5% of the purchase price, which might not be possible.
Because they're negotiating that with their agents.
Because they don't know what either the buyer's paying the agent, which in VA obviously can't, but if the buyer's paying the agent, then they're just getting their own money back.
Yep.
Which would eliminate them completely. If the seller's paying the buyer's agent commission, but it's not, what if it's 2% and they publicly market 1.5% back? There's no way a buyer's agent would ever do that because they will make
nothing.
0.5% minus broker fees, which would be like $500.
Yep.
Right.
So like those companies are going to be in a whirlwind pretty fast.
They'll have to rework how they have it all spelled out. The question I had too is like, if everybody's signing all these different documents now, is the seller and the buyer, listing agent and the buyer's agent signing if the lead came from a stately and we're paying them 25%? Does everyone get to know where all the money is going all the time?
It should be that way.
Yeah,
I think.
But do you think that's what's going to happen? Do you think there should be another document?
Tell us about how much
They're removing transparency though, so I would think no.
Yeah.
I think. I mean, obviously, agents are listening to this. This probably will be a podcast that I'm guessing we'll get a little more attention on too, because there's just so much interest in what's going on right now. As you can hear, we have a lot of questions too, right? So you're not alone in feeling like you have questions about this because it's not all fleshed out. There's a lot that's still going to happen, but it's happening fast. And we're talking, 4 months out from now, right? So the way that we're looking at it is, we have to continue to move forward in the world that we're in, right? So we're married to this. We want to continue to do a good job supporting our team. We want to do a good job supporting our buyers. We want to do a good job being consultants for clients as agents and real estate professionals. So we're going to do everything in our power to make sure that we're doing the best possible work to prove our value and to ensure our team is set up for success. So continue to take action in thinking about this and planning for this, and continue to listen to other podcasts and other people that know what they're talking about to better yourself when it comes to knowing how to do this. But B, also, I don't think at this point it's time to say the sky is falling, my career is over, I'm going to never be able to do this again, because people will continue to buy and sell real estate, right? The market is not going to just go to zero. And so someone is going to come out of this with success in the future, right? Your commissions may come down a little bit, but maybe there'll be fewer agents and you'll be able to have fewer multiple offer situations, et cetera, right? Don't just assume that this means the end of your career, but do know that finding other people who are smart and focused and actually going to get through this, because there will be a falling out period here, is how you're going to have the best chance of surviving. So I don't mean to there's the negative side of me that's a little nervous about this, but there's also just this, try to take a 30,000 foot view and say there's going to still be people that are doing this once this is all said and done. So think about how you can be one of those people and what you need to do to get there. Would be my advice to anybody listening to this.
And that's all we have this week on the Nerdy Agent Podcast. And as always, and more than ever, please be better.
Bye-bye.